I never imagined my own children would try to turn me into an international trafficker, just to steal every last dollar I had built over 65 years of my life. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we post new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 65 years old, and for 4 decades I built a business empire in the textile industry that allowed me to accumulate a net worth of $2.8 million. I've been a widow for 8 years, ever since I lost my dear husband Michael in a car accident, and from that day on, I dedicated myself completely to my 2 children, David, my 38-year-old son, a business administrator, and Patricia, my 35-year-old daughter, a law school graduate. On October 15th, 2023, a Sunday I will never forget, the 3 of us were at Chicago O'Hare Airport, preparing for a business trip to Bogota. I had decided to expand my textile operations to Colombia, and my children insisted on coming with me to learn about international markets, or so they said. For days, David had personally taken charge of packing my luggage, which struck me as odd because my assistant had always handled those details. "Mom, let me check your suitcase one more time," he had told me that very morning, with a smile that now, looking back, seems sinister. "I want to make sure you have everything you need to make a good impression on the Colombian business owners." Patricia, for her part, had suggested last-minute changes to our itinerary. It would be better to take the 3 p.m. flight instead of the morning one, she proposed the previous Friday. "I've read there are fewer security checks at that time." At that moment, I just thought she wanted to sleep in later, something typical of her since she was a teenager. While we were waiting in the boarding lounge, I noticed something strange about my children's behavior. They held whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I got close. David was constantly checking his cell phone with a nervous expression, and Patricia avoided eye contact with me, which was very unusual for a girl who had always been tremendously expressive. "Is everything okay, kids?" I asked them around 2:30 in the afternoon, with just 30 minutes left until boarding. "Of course, Mom," David answered far too quickly. "We're just excited about the trip." It was exactly at 2:43 in the afternoon when my cell phone started to ring. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I hesitated for a moment before answering, but something inside me pushed me to take the call. "Eleanor Vance?" asked a male voice that I recognized immediately, even though it had been over 2 years since I'd last heard it. "Richard Miller?" I responded, surprised to hear from the man who had been my children's partner in a failed import business back in 2021. "Eleanor, listen to me very carefully, and don't ask any questions." His voice sounded desperate, almost broken with urgency. "Leave the airport now. Don't say anything to your children. They've put drugs in your suitcase to frame you. You have to leave now." The world around me stood still. Richard's words echoed in my head like hammer blows. Drugs? My children? Framing me? For a few seconds that felt like an eternity, my mind refused to process what I had just heard. "Richard, what are you talking about?" I whispered, trying to keep my composure as I watched David and Patricia, who were still absorbed in their phones. "There's no time for explanations, Eleanor. Your life is in danger. If they find you with those drugs, you'll spend the rest of your days in a Colombian prison. Trust me, just like you trust the sun will rise tomorrow. Go now." The line went dead abruptly. I just stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, feeling the airport floor move beneath my feet. Richard's words kept pounding in my brain. "They've put drugs in your suitcase to frame you." It was impossible. Absolutely impossible. These were my children, my own flesh and blood, the human beings I had worked tirelessly for over decades. But something in Richard's voice, that genuine desperation, that urgency I had never heard from him before, made me hesitate. My survival instinct, forged in 40 years of tough business decisions, began to kick in. If there was even the slightest chance that Richard was telling the truth, staying meant risking my freedom, my reputation, and possibly the rest of my life. David looked up from his phone and glanced at me curiously. "Who was that, Mom? You looked worried." "No one important," I lied, feeling my hands begin to tremble slightly. I just realized I forgot some crucial documents at home. The contracts for the Medellin fashion textile company that we reviewed last night." Patricia frowned. "The contracts? But, Mom, we can get digital copies from Colombia. Isn't it necessary to—" "Isn't it?" I interrupted her with more force than I intended. These are documents with original signatures, essential for closing the deal. Without them, this trip would be pointless. I stared at her, searching for any trace of guilt in her eyes, any sign that would confirm Richard's words. Patricia looked away, down at the floor, a gesture I knew from when she was a little girl and had broken a vase or gotten bad grades in school. "But, Mom," David insisted, getting up from his seat. "We only have 20 minutes until boarding. There's no time to go home and come back. We can reschedule the flight for early tomorrow morning." "No," I repeated, feeling my nervousness grow with every passing second. "You two can take this flight. I'll meet you at the hotel tomorrow night." "It's decided." I walked over to my carry-on suitcase, an elegant black leather piece I had bought in Barcelona the year before. When I reached out to grab it, David quickly stepped in my way. "Mom, let me help you with the luggage," he said with a smile that now seemed forced. "It's very heavy." "I can handle my own suitcase, David," I replied, gently but firmly pushing him aside. "I've been carrying suitcases for more years than you've been alive." I took my suitcase and started walking towards the exit, feeling my children's gazes fixed on my back like daggers. Every step away from them was harder than the last, not because of the physical weight of the luggage, but because of the emotional weight of what I was possibly discovering. "Mom, wait!" Patricia shouted behind me. "This is ridiculous, the documents can wait." But I didn't stop. I kept walking towards the terminal exit, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the airport noise. When I reached the food court, I found a table where I could discreetly watch the boarding gate without being seen. I sat in a corner of a Starbucks, ordered an espresso I knew I wouldn't be able to drink, and kept my eyes fixed on my children. David was pacing back and forth, talking on the phone with obvious agitation. Patricia remained seated, but her body language showed a tension I had never seen in her before. It was exactly 17 minutes of waiting that felt like 17 hours. At 3:15, when the flight should have already taken off, I saw something that changed my life forever. 3 airport security agents, accompanied by 2 police officers, walked directly towards David and Patricia. They surrounded them discreetly but authoritatively, and I could see one of them asking for their identification. My blood ran cold when I saw another agent open my carry-on suitcase, the same one David had insisted on packing personally. From my position, I could clearly see the agent put on gloves, reach inside, and pull out something that made everyone present step back immediately. It was several white packages, wrapped in clear plastic, and something that looked like an electronic device with wires. Even from a distance, I could tell it was a significant amount of what was obviously cocaine. Patricia brought her hands to her mouth, pretending to be surprised, but I knew every one of her gestures since she was a baby. That wasn't genuine surprise. It was the panic of being caught. David, on the other hand, was trying to gesture and explain something to the agents, but his body language betrayed his guilt. They were both handcuffed immediately. The device found next to the drugs prompted more specialized units to arrive, probably the anti-terrorism squad. The area was quickly evacuated, and I watched as my children were led away to a restricted area of the airport. I sat there, watching them take David and Patricia away, feeling an indescribable mix of pain, betrayal, and, paradoxically, relief. Richard had been right. My own children, the reason I had worked tirelessly for decades, had tried to turn me into an international criminal. I left the airport like a ghost, dragging my suitcase and feeling that each step took me further not just from the place, but from the life I had known. The taxi ride to my house in the Gold Coast neighborhood was completely silent. The driver tried to make conversation a few times, but my one-word answers quickly discouraged him. Once home, I went straight to my study and locked the door. I needed to think, to analyze, to understand how I had gotten into this situation without realizing it. I poured myself a scotch, the same kind Michael and I used to share on winter nights, and sat down at my oak desk. Reality was slowly starting to sink in. My children had tried to frame me with drugs. But why? What had driven them to plan something so monstrous against their own mother? I started mentally reviewing the last few months, looking for clues that I had ignored or misinterpreted at the time. The first sign that now made sense dated back to March. David had come to visit me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because our family gatherings were normally on Sundays. He seemed nervous, restless, and he asked to borrow $50,000 for an investment opportunity in cryptocurrency. "It's a safe investment, Mom," he had insisted that afternoon. "In 6 months, I can pay you back double." His insistence seemed strange. because David had always been cautious with money, even conservative, but I agreed, trusting his business judgment. He never paid me back. Every time I asked about it, he gave me excuses. The market is fluctuating. I need to wait for the right moment to withdraw. The platform is having some temporary technical issues. Patricia, for her part, had shown equally worrying changes in behavior. In July, she had started asking me insistently about my will. "Mom, do you have all your legal documents in order?" she asked during a family dinner. At your age, it's important to have everything well structured. At the time, I interpreted her words as genuine concern from a loving daughter. Now I understood she had been assessing the legal mechanisms to access my estate. I also remembered their increasingly frequent visits to my house over the last 8 months. They always had plausible excuses. "I wanted to see how you are. I brought your favorite dish. I needed to use your printer." But now I realized they always found reasons to be left alone in my study, the place where I kept my most important financial documents. The house phone started ringing insistently. It was Patricia, calling from the airport or wherever they had taken her. I let it go to voicemail. "Mom, please pick up." Her voice sounded desperate through the speaker. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Someone put those horrible things in your suitcase. We need you to come and clear this up. We're victims of a conspiracy." Victims of a conspiracy. The words sounded so absurd they almost made me laugh bitterly. If there was a conspiracy, they were the conspirators, not the victims. For the next 3 days, my children tried to contact me by every means possible. Phone calls, text messages, emails. They even sent some mutual acquaintances to intercede for them. They all repeated the same story. It had been a setup. Someone else had planted the drugs in my luggage. They were innocent, but I knew my children better than anyone. I had seen their faces when the agents found the cocaine. There was no genuine surprise in their expressions, only the panic of being caught. On Thursday afternoon, I decided to meticulously review my bank statements from the last 12 months. What I discovered left me breathless. There were transfers I didn't remember authorizing, small amounts that didn't stand out individually, but when added up, they represented a considerable sum. Transfers of $3,000 here, $5,000 there, $8,000 on another occasion, all to accounts I didn't recognize, with vague descriptions like business consulting, legal advice, or professional services. The total amounted to more than $70,000 in the last 6 months. I immediately called my bank. After identifying myself through multiple security protocols, the account executive confirmed that all the transfers had been made from my online banking using my personal access codes. "Mrs. Vance." "Miss," Martinez explained, "these transactions were executed from your personal computer, at times that match your usual pattern of banking activity. The system did not detect any irregularities. Of course, they hadn't detected any irregularities. David and Patricia knew my routines. They had access to my computer during their frequent visits and had probably watched me enter my passwords while pretending to be interested in other things." That same night, while reviewing more documents in my study, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the bottom drawer of my desk, hidden behind some old folders, there was a manila envelope I didn't remember putting there. Inside the envelope, I found copies of legal documents I had never signed. They were power of attorney documents granting David and Patricia full authorization to manage my assets in case of temporary or permanent mental or physical incapacity. The documents were dated 2 months prior and bore what looked like my signature, but I had never signed those papers. I had never visited the notary's office listed on the letterhead, and I had definitely never authorized my children to take total control of my estate. I carefully examined my supposed signature. It was an excellent forgery, almost perfect, but there were tiny differences in the pressure of the stroke and the slant of certain letters that only I could detect. The full picture was beginning to form in my mind with terrifying clarity. My children had not only planned to frame me with drugs to get me out of the country or put me in prison, they had also prepared the legal mechanisms to seize my entire estate while I fought criminal charges from a cell. It was a meticulously crafted plan, executed over months, right under my nose, by the 2 people I trusted most in the world. The next day, I decided I needed professional help to completely unravel the web of deceit my children had woven around me. I couldn't face this situation alone, especially when each new discovery revealed the depth of their betrayal. Through a trusted business contact, I got the number for Anthony White, a private investigator with 20 years of experience in family and financial fraud cases. His office was located on Michigan Avenue, just a few blocks from my home. Anthony was a man in his 50s, bald, with penetrating eyes and a direct manner that inspired immediate confidence. His office was filled with professional certificates and photographs that showed his background in law enforcement before he became a private investigator. "Mrs. Vance," he said after listening to my story for almost an hour, "what you're telling me is not unusual in cases involving multi-million-dollar inheritances. Adult children with financial problems can go to unthinkable extremes." I gave him all the evidence I had gathered. The bank statements with the suspicious transfers, the copies of the forged power of attorney documents, and all the details about David and Patricia's strange behavior over the last few months. "I need you to find out exactly what my children have been up to," I explained. "I want to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be." Anthony nodded gravely. "I should warn you, these family investigations often uncover very unpleasant secrets. Are you prepared to face whatever we might discover?" "At this point, Mr. White, I think I'm prepared for anything." Over the next 5 days, Anthony conducted an exhaustive investigation that included discreet surveillance, analysis of public records, verification of bank movements, and contacts with sources in different institutions. His efficiency was impressive. The following Tuesday, Anthony summoned me to his office with results that exceeded my worst expectations. He had prepared a complete file with photographs, documents, and recordings that painted a devastating picture of my children's activities. "David has a serious online gambling problem," Anthony began, showing me screenshots from multiple betting platforms. "Our analysis indicates he has lost approximately $95,000 in the last 14 months. His debts to international bookmakers have escalated to dangerous levels." He showed me discreetly taken photographs of David meeting with intimidating-looking individuals in shady bars. "These are professional collectors, Mrs. Vance, people you don't mess with. David has received serious threats." The information about Patricia was just as devastating. "Your daughter is having an extramarital affair with Daniel Reed, a married real estate developer," Anthony continued, showing me compromising photos taken at discreet hotels. "The problem is, this man's wife found out and hired a detective to document the affair. Now she's blackmailing Patricia, demanding $45,000 in exchange for not making the evidence public." Anthony had obtained copies of some text messages between Patricia and her blackmailer. I read them with a mixture of sadness and disgust. My daughter, the respectable lawyer I had raised with such care, was involved in situations I would have never imagined possible. "But there's more," Anthony continued, opening another folder. "The bank transfers you detected are just the tip of the iceberg. We've identified a pattern of systematic theft that extends over 8 months. He showed me a detailed analysis of my financial movements. David had used a sophisticated technique, small, frequent transfers to ghost accounts that then redistributed the money to various destinations. The total amount stolen was $180,000. "How is it possible I didn't notice such a large amount?" I asked, feeling foolish and betrayed in equal measure. "Because they are professionals at this," Anthony replied. "The individual amounts never exceeded $10,000. They were always made on dates that coincided with legitimate movements of your company, and the descriptions were carefully crafted to look like normal business expenses." The investigation had also revealed that David and Patricia had purchased a property in Cartagena, Colombia, using the stolen money. The deed was in the name of an offshore company created specifically to hide the transaction. This property, valued at $200,000, was their escape plan, Anthony explained. "After framing you with the drugs and gaining legal control of your estate through the forged documents, they would have progressively transferred your assets to Colombia and disappeared." I felt physically nauseous processing all this information. It wasn't just the money. It was the calculated cruelty of the plan, the coldness with which they had planned to destroy my life to save their own. Anthony showed me documents proving that my children had consulted with lawyers specializing in extradition, apparently to ensure that Colombia would not send me back to the United States once I was accused of international drug trafficking. "And Richard Miller?" I asked, remembering the call that had saved me. "How does he fit into all this?" "Richard was initially contacted by your children to participate in the scheme," Anthony replied. "According to our sources, they offered him $100,000 to help coordinate the operation from Colombia, but Richard flatly refused and decided to warn you instead. Why would he do that?" "Richard and I haven't had contact in years." "Apparently, Richard knows them better than you do," Anthony said with a sad smile. He told us he always suspected David and Patricia were capable of anything for money, but he never imagined they would go this far. The investigation had also documented that my children had hired specialized criminals in Colombia to plant the cocaine in my luggage. The device found next to the drugs was a fake artifact designed to look like an explosive to aggravate the charges against me. Mrs. Vance, Anthony concluded, your children not only planned to frame you for drug trafficking, they also wanted you to be accused of terrorism. With those two charges, you would have spent the rest of your life in prison, with no possibility of defending yourself or recovering your assets. I remained silent for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what I had discovered. My own children, to solve their personal financial problems, had been willing to completely sacrifice my life, my freedom, and my dignity. I left Anthony's office with a folder full of evidence that proved the most absolute betrayal I could imagine. Every document, every photograph, every bank record confirmed that my children had meticulously orchestrated my destruction over 8 long months. That night, in the solitude of my study, I spread all the papers across my desk and began to piece together the complete puzzle of their conspiracy. The timeline was chilling in its precision. It all started in February 2023, when David lost a considerable sum on a sports betting platform called Golden Bet International. According to the records Anthony had obtained, David had bet his life savings on a series of soccer matches that turned out to be catastrophic for him. Desperation led him to seek more money, this time in higher-risk online casinos. Patricia, initially unaware of her brother's problems, got involved when David asked her to co-sign a $30,000 loan with her lawyer's signature. It was then that Patricia began her affair with Daniel Reed, seeking in him not only an emotional escape, but also a potential source of funding for their family problems. However, when Daniel's wife discovered them, the situation turned into a blackmail nightmare that required immediate money. The siblings found themselves trapped in a downward spiral. David owed $95,000 to international betting organizations that had started sending physical collectors, while Patricia faced the threat of public exposure that would destroy her legal career. It was during one of their desperate meetings in April that they conceived the plan to access my estate. They initially considered asking me for the money directly, but they knew I would never approve of such sums to cover gambling debts and blackmail. Anthony had provided me with transcripts of phone conversations legally intercepted during the investigation. Reading my children's exact words, planning my ruin, made me physically ill. "Mom is never going to give us that much money at once," Patricia had said during a call on April 23rd. "We need to find another way to access the inheritance. What if something happens to her?" David had replied with a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. "An accident, an illness, something that would allow us to take legal control of her assets. Accidents are unpredictable and suspicious," Patricia had retorted. "We need something that seems completely unrelated to us." That's when David suggested the idea of framing me with drugs during an international trip. If Mom is arrested for trafficking in Colombia, she would automatically lose legal capacity to manage her assets. We, as her only heirs, could take control through power of attorney. The conversation continued with details that turned my stomach. They had meticulously researched extradition laws between Colombia and the United States, the legal procedures for declaring civil incapacity, and the mechanisms for transferring assets abroad without raising suspicion. Patricia, using her legal knowledge, had designed the entire legal structure. The forged power of attorney documents were not a mistake or an afterthought. They were an integral part of the plan from the beginning. "Once Mom is in a Colombian prison," Patricia had explained in another recording from May 8th, "we'll have years to liquidate her assets and transfer everything to our offshore accounts. When she finally gets out, if she ever gets out, there will be nothing left to recover." David had been in charge of the dirtier aspects of the plan. His contacts in the gambling world had connected him with Colombian criminals specializing in trafficking, who for $50,000 had agreed to plant the cocaine in my luggage and create the fake device to aggravate the charges. The level of detail in their preparations was professional. They had studied the airport's security schedules, identified cleaning staff with access to luggage areas, and bribed specific employees to ensure my suitcase would be tampered with, undetected. They had even practiced placing the drugs using a suitcase identical to mine, timing each step of the process to minimize risks. Anthony showed me photographs of these rehearsals, conducted in David's apartment on weekends in September. The choice of Colombia as a destination was no accident. David and Patricia had researched exhaustively and discovered that Colombia had the most severe penalties for international drug trafficking, especially when combined with terrorism charges for the fake explosive device. In Colombia, Mom would get between 20 and 30 years in prison, Patricia had commented with chilling pragmatism in a conversation on September 15th. At her age, that's a life sentence. The most painful part of it all was discovering how they had manipulated my emotions during those months. The frequent visits, the unexpected gifts, the family dinners where they expressed their affection. It had all been an act, designed to maintain my trust while they executed their plan. David had used each visit to progressively install spyware on my computer, allowing them to monitor my bank passwords and financial movements. Patricia had used her legal knowledge to identify important documents and create the necessary forgeries. They had even manipulated my daily routines. David's insistence on packing my luggage was no coincidence. He had been practicing for weeks to ensure he could plant the drugs without me noticing any changes in the weight or distribution of the suitcase. The fraudulent bank transfers had followed a carefully calculated pattern. They never stole on consecutive dates. They always waited at least a week between transactions and varied the amounts to avoid patterns detectable by bank security systems. Anthony had discovered they had even hired an accountant specializing in tax evasion to structure the transfers to look like legitimate business expenses. Every move was designed to go unnoticed for as long as possible. The property in Cartagena wasn't just their escape plan. They had also established a network of local contacts there who would help them establish new identities if necessary. Patricia had secretly traveled to Colombia in August to finalize these arrangements, telling me she was going to a legal seminar in Barcelona. After reviewing all the documents, I sat in my chair for hours, feeling everything I had believed about my children crumble. They weren't young adults with financial problems. They were sophisticated criminals, willing to destroy their own mother to save themselves from a life of excess and irresponsibility. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront the deepest, most painful truth of this whole situation. The role of Michael Sierra, my trusted lawyer for the past 15 years. Anthony had mentioned his name in the investigation, but I had resisted believing that Michael could be involved. Michael had handled all my legal affairs since 2008, when my husband and I restructured our will after expanding the textile business. He was more than my lawyer. I considered him a close friend, someone who knew every detail of my finances and had dined at my house on multiple occasions. I requested an urgent meeting with him, telling him over the phone that I needed to review some documents related to the airport incident. His voice sounded strangely nervous as we agreed to meet at his office on State Street that afternoon. Before the appointment, I called Anthony and asked him to accompany me discreetly. "I want you to observe his behavior when I ask him certain questions," I explained. "If Michael is involved in this, I need to know for sure." Michael's office was on the 7th floor of an elegant building with panoramic views of Chicago that had always impressed me. That afternoon, however, everything seemed different, tainted by suspicion and distrust. Michael greeted me with his usual professional smile, but I noticed something forced in his cordiality. He was a man of 60, gray-haired, with gold-rimmed glasses and always impeccable suits. I knew his every gesture after so many years of professional relationship. "Eleanor, what a terrible thing that happened at the airport," he began, motioning for me to take a chair in front of his mahogany desk. "David and Patricia have contacted me from the precinct. They insist it's all a misunderstanding." "They contacted you?" I asked, feigning surprise. "What for?" "They want me to represent them legally," Michael replied, avoiding direct eye contact. "Obviously, given my relationship with you, I explained to them that it would be a conflict of interest." He was lying. Anthony had shown me phone records proving that Michael had had extensive conversations with David and Patricia over the past few weeks, long before the airport incident. "Michael," I said, adopting a casual tone, "I need you to explain these documents to me." I placed the copies of the forged power of attorney documents I had found in my house on his desk. His reaction was immediate and revealing. The color drained from his face, his hands began to tremble slightly, and he took off his glasses to clean them unnecessarily. A nervous tic, I knew well. These documents," he stammered. "I don't recognize them immediately. Where did you find them? In my own house, I replied, watching every micro-expression on his face. In my personal desk, hidden behind other files. The documents bear the seal of your notary and are dated 2 months ago. Michael took the papers with visibly shaking hands and examined them with an exaggerated attention that only confirmed his guilt. Eleanor, I never prepared these documents. Someone must have forged my notary seal. Someone like who? I pressed, remaining outwardly calm. I don't know, he answered too quickly. Maybe David and Patricia consulted with another lawyer without telling you. It's possible that someone is trying to frame me too. At that moment, Anthony discreetly entered the office, introducing himself as an inspector from the Financial Crimes Unit. Michael didn't know that Anthony was my hired private investigator. Mr. Sierra, Anthony said with professional authority, we are investigating a case of document fraud related to Mrs. Vance. We need to ask you some questions. Michael stood up nervously. Of course, Inspector. I am fully willing to cooperate with the authorities. Anthony placed a digital recorder on the desk. This conversation will be recorded for legal purposes. Have David and Patricia Vance communicated with you during the last 4 weeks? Well, yes, Michael admitted, but only for routine legal consultations. What kind of consultations? Anthony insisted. Michael hesitated for several seconds before answering. They asked about procedures for handling situations where a family member might need legal assistance abroad. Situations like arrests for drug trafficking? Anthony asked directly. No, Michael exclaimed with too much vehemence. They never mentioned drugs. They spoke of hypothetical situations, academic inquiries. Anthony then showed a photograph taken 3 weeks earlier, where Michael was having lunch with David at a discreet restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago. Was this also an academic inquiry? Michael visibly slumped in his chair. He knew he was caught in a lie, and that any further explanation would only worsen his situation. Michael, I said, my voice surprisingly calm, we've had a 15-year professional relationship. I've trusted you with all my financial secrets. You've dined at my table. You knew my husband when he was still alive. How could you betray me like this? Tears began to well up in his eyes. Eleanor, you don't know what they asked me to do. David told me you were losing your mental faculties, that you had started making irrational decisions with your money, and that's why you decided to forge power of attorney documents? They paid me $25,000, he confessed through sobs. I have huge debts with the IRS. I was going to lose my professional license. Patricia convinced me that they would only be backup documents, that they would never actually be used. Anthony continued to press him. What else did you help them prepare? I reviewed the extradition laws between the U.S. and Colombia, Michael admitted. I explained the procedures for declaring temporary civil incapacity. I also helped them structure the bank transfers to look like legitimate business operations. Did you know they were going to frame me with drugs? I asked him directly. Michael shook his head vigorously. Never. They told me you were going to have minor legal problems in Colombia related to business documentation. They never mentioned drugs or anything related to trafficking. But Anthony had more evidence. He showed call logs proving constant communication between Michael and my children in the days leading up to the airport trip. Mr. Sierra, Anthony said, we have recordings of phone conversations where you specifically discussed the charges she would face and how that would affect her legal capacity to manage her estate. Michael broke down completely. Yes, it's true. I knew the plan involved framing you with something serious in Colombia. David assured me the charges would be fabricated, that after a few months they could prove your innocence and recover all the money. And in the meantime? I asked. In the meantime, they would have legal access to your assets, too, to manage the crisis and pay the Colombian lawyers needed for your defense. The lie was so elaborate, so convincingly presented, that I could almost understand how Michael had rationalized his involvement. Almost, but not completely. Michael, I said finally, you destroyed 15 years of trust and friendship for $25,000. I hope it was worth it. We left the office, leaving Michael emotionally shattered, but with a full, recorded confession that would be crucial for the legal case I was building against my children. That same afternoon, after the devastating confrontation with Michael, I decided it was time to find Richard Miller, the man who had saved my life with that desperate call at the airport. I needed to fully understand his role in this story, and more importantly, to thank him personally for having the courage to warn me. Anthony had gotten Richard's address. He lived in a modest apartment in the Pilsen neighborhood, a far cry from the lifestyle he had led when he was partners with my children in the import business that failed in 2021. I called his phone from the car on my way to his place. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice sounding surprised but relieved when I identified myself. "Eleanor," he said immediately. "I've been waiting for your call since I saw the news about the airport. Are you okay? Are you safe?" "I'm fine, Richard, thanks to you," I replied sincerely. "Can we meet? I need to understand exactly what happened and how you knew about my children's plan." "Of course, come to my house. I have a lot to explain." Richard's apartment was small but clean, decorated with functional furniture and family photos that showed better times. It was clear he had experienced a significant financial downturn since the failure of his partnership with David and Patricia. Richard greeted me with a genuine hug, something I didn't expect after so many years without contact. He was 52, thinner than I remembered, with premature gray hair that betrayed the stress of recent times. "Eleanor, you have no idea how glad I am to see you safe," he said, pouring me a coffee in his small kitchen. "For days, I've had nightmares thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't called in time." "Richard, I need you to tell me everything from the beginning," I said, sitting on his worn sofa. "How did you know about the plan? When did David and Patricia contact you?" Richard sighed deeply before starting his story. "It all began in early September. David called me after almost 2 years of no contact. He said he had a business opportunity that could solve my financial problems permanently. He explained that David had been very careful in the first conversations, only mentioning that it was an operation in Colombia that required knowledge of the South American market, something Richard had developed during his years as an importer. "The first meeting was at a coffee shop near Union Station," Richard continued. "David arrived with Patricia, which I found strange because she had never shown any interest in international business. During that initial meeting, my children had proposed he participate in what they described as a complex financial operation that would involve discreetly transferring funds from the United States to Colombia. They offered me $100,000 for 3 months of work," Richard said, looking at me with eyes full of remorse. "For someone in my financial situation, it was a huge temptation." Richard confessed that he had initially considered accepting the proposal. His debts, accumulated after the business failure, had him on the verge of bankruptcy, and David's offer seemed like an unexpected salvation. "But when they started explaining the specific details, something didn't add up," he continued. "Patricia mentioned they would need to establish a solid alibi for a certain date in October, and David talked about the importance of having reliable contacts in Colombian prisons. It was during the second meeting, held at Patricia's apartment a week later, that Richard began to suspect the operation was not a legitimate business. David was drunk that night," Richard recalled. "He started talking about solving the old woman problem and about how they could finally access what was rightfully theirs. When Richard asked for clarification about who the old woman was, Patricia tried to change the subject, but David, drunk on alcohol and excitement, had revealed too much. He told me they were going to neutralize his mother so they could manage her money without interference," Richard continued. "When I asked him what neutralize meant, David laughed and said you were going to have serious legal problems in Colombia." Richard had left the meeting that night feeling deeply uneasy. But David had contacted him insistently over the following days, increasing the financial offer to $150,000. "The third meeting was the final one," Richard explained. "Patricia had prepared a full presentation with slides, as if it were a legitimate business proposal. During that presentation, Patricia had explained the plan in detail. I would be framed with drugs during the trip to Bogotá and would face criminal charges that would keep me in prison for years. Meanwhile, they would assume legal control of my estate. Patricia showed the power of attorney documents she had prepared. She explained how they had calculated the legal timelines for international transfers and detailed the schedule for liquidating your assets," Richard recalled, with evident disgust. "And what would your specific role be?" I asked. "I was supposed to coordinate the operations from Colombia," he replied. "Establish contacts with local lawyers to handle your legal case. Make sure the charges were serious enough to keep you in prison for the necessary time and facilitate the bank transfers from Colombian accounts." Richard showed me documents he had kept from those meetings: draft contracts, bank transfer schematics, and a list of criminal contacts in Bogotá that David had compiled. When I saw all this in writing, I realized it wasn't just a shady business deal. They were willing to condemn you to decades in prison to solve their money problems. Why did you decide to warn me? I asked. Richard was silent for several moments before answering. Because I remembered how you treated me during the failure of my company with your children. When everything fell apart and I lost my savings, David and Patricia blamed me for everything and completely abandoned me. He explained that I had been the only person who had shown compassion during his financial crisis. Although I hadn't been able to help him financially, as the business failure was partly his fault, I had maintained a respectful attitude and had avoided blaming him publicly. You were the only person who treated me with dignity during the worst time of my life, Richard continued. David and Patricia, on the other hand, treated me like disposable trash when I was no longer useful to them. That experience showed me the true character of your children, he added. They are people who use others as long as it's convenient and destroy them when they're no longer needed. I knew they would do the exact same thing to you, but 1,000 times worse because you had so much more to lose. Richard confessed that he had spent weeks struggling internally with the decision to warn me. On one hand, he desperately needed the money David and Patricia had offered. On the other, he knew that participating in the plan would make him an accomplice to one of the cruelest crimes imaginable. The final decision came when David showed me pictures of the property in Cartagena they had bought with your money, Richard said. They were so proud of their investment, so sure that their plan would work perfectly, that they made me sick. I decided I'd rather stay poor than become an accomplice to such a betrayal. After my revealing conversation with Richard, I returned home that night with a steely determination I hadn't felt in years. I had all the pieces of the puzzle, all the necessary evidence, and all the testimonies that proved my children's conspiracy against me. It was time to act decisively. The next day, very early in the morning, I requested an urgent meeting with the Chicago Police Department's Central Command. Anthony accompanied me, carrying the complete file from the private investigation we had conducted over the past few weeks. Inspector Elena Vasquez, a woman in her mid-40s with a serious and professional expression, received us in her office. She had been following the case since the airport incident and knew the basic details of the charges against David and Patricia. Mrs. Vance, the inspector began, your children have been formally charged with drug trafficking and terrorist conspiracy. However, they maintain their innocence and claim that someone else placed the substances in your luggage. Inspector, I replied, placing the folder of evidence on her desk. I have information that will prove not only their guilt, but the full extent of their conspiracy against me. For the next 3 hours, Anthony and I meticulously presented every element of our investigation. The bank records showing the fraudulent transfers, the recordings of conversations where they planned my framing, the forged documents they had prepared to seize my estate. Inspector Vasquez examined each document with professional attention. Her expression grew more grim as the presentation went on, especially when she heard the recordings of the phone conversations between David, Patricia, and Michael. This is one of the most elaborate family conspiracies I've seen in my 20-year career, the inspector commented after reviewing all the material. The premeditation, the sophistication of the plan, and the coldness with which they plan to destroy your life is extraordinary. I also explained Richard's role as a key witness, someone who had been directly contacted by my children to participate in the scheme, but had decided to warn me at the last moment. Mrs. Vance, the inspector told me, this information turns the case into something much more serious than simple drug trafficking. We're talking about systematic bank fraud, forgery of official documents, organized criminal conspiracy, and attempted unlawful imprisonment. We agreed that I would fully cooperate with the official investigation, providing complete access to my financial records and detailed testimony about all the events I had observed over the preceding months. The inspector explained that with the new evidence, the district attorney's office could file additional charges that would significantly increase the potential sentences for David and Patricia. They could face between 12 and 20 years in prison each, she informed me. That same afternoon, the police executed search warrants at David's and Patricia's homes. The results were devastating to any hope they might have had of maintaining their story of innocence. In David's apartment, they found documentation related to the international betting sites, correspondence with the collectors who were threatening him, and most incriminatingly, a laptop with specialized software for remotely accessing banking systems. The forensic analysis of that computer revealed that David had been monitoring my bank accounts for months, capturing my passwords and access patterns to make the fraudulent transfers without being detected. In Patricia's house, investigators found a safe hidden behind a painting in her bedroom. Inside were copies of all the forged documents related to me, including drafts of power of attorney documents with different versions of my supposed signature. Even more revealing, they found a handwritten notebook where Patricia had detailed every step of the plan, month by month. Her own words, in her own handwriting, documented the evolution of the conspiracy from the initial idea to the final preparations. March 15th. David lost another $20,000 last night. We need to access Mom's inheritance sooner than planned, Patricia had written in one entry. April 8th. Contacted Michael today. He's desperate for money due to problems with the IRS. He could be useful for preparing the necessary legal documentation, she continued in another entry. May 25th. David found contacts in Colombia willing to help with the special merchandise. The cost will be $50,000, but it's a necessary investment, she had noted in May. The notebook also contained detailed calculations on how to distribute my estate once they gained legal control. They had planned for every last dollar. How much they would use to pay their debts, how much they would transfer to Colombia, and how much they would keep in U.S. accounts to finance my legal defense. The most chilling entry was dated October 10th, just 5 days before the airport incident. Everything is ready. Mom will never suspect a thing. In 1 week, all our problems will be over and we will have full access to the $2.8 million. David practiced placing the packages in the suitcase this morning. It took less than 3 minutes. Investigators also found email correspondence between Patricia and Colombian lawyers specializing in international trafficking cases. She had been negotiating fees and defense strategies, not to actually protect me, but to prolong my imprisonment long enough to complete the asset transfers. In one of those emails, Patricia had written, "The objective is not to win the case, but to keep my mother in pretrial detention for at least 18 months while we resolve the asset situation in the United States." The police investigation also revealed that David had established direct contact with criminal organizations in Colombia using encrypted messaging apps. The recovered messages showed specific negotiations about the type and quantity of drugs to be planted in my luggage. "We need enough for international trafficking charges, but not so much that it seems implausible for an older woman," David had written to his criminal contacts. The Colombian criminal's response was equally cold. 5 kilos of pure cocaine, plus the fake device will guarantee 20 to 25 years in prison. Total cost, $75,000, 50% upfront. Bank records confirmed that David had made exactly those transfers to accounts in Medellin in the days leading up to our scheduled trip. Perhaps the most painful discovery of all was a file on Patricia's computer titled Liquidation Schedule, EV Estate. It was a meticulously detailed Excel document showing how they planned to systematically dismantle everything I had built over 4 decades of work. They had calculated the value of every property, every investment, every bank account. They had even researched the market value of personal items, like my late husband's jewelry and my art collections. The entire plan was designed to be executed over a 2-year period, the time they calculated it would take for me to get any kind of parole in Colombia, if I got it at all. By the time I got out of prison, if I ever got out, there would be absolutely nothing left of the life I had built. They had planned my economic, legal, and personal destruction with a precision that bordered on professional. With all the evidence gathered and the police investigation underway, the most difficult moment of this entire process arrived, witnessing the official interrogations of David and Patricia. Inspector Vasquez had invited me to observe from an adjoining room, separated by a one-way mirror that would allow me to see and hear everything without being seen. The first interrogation was David's, scheduled for Tuesday, November 7th, at 9 inches the morning. Seeing him enter the room in handcuffs, wearing the orange jumpsuit of a detainee, produced an indescribable feeling of pain mixed with rage. This was my son. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, whom I had taken to his first day of school, whom I had comforted during his first heartbreaks. David had lost weight during the 3 weeks of pre-trial detention. His hair was disheveled, he had deep dark circles under his eyes, and his posture showed the tension of someone who knew his situation was desperate. Prosecutor Fernando Castillo, a meticulous man in his 50 began the interrogation by showing David the evidence one by one. First, the records from the betting sites documenting his $95,000 losses. "David," the prosecutor said in a neutral voice. "These documents show that between February and September 2023, you lost an amount equivalent to a 3-year salary on online betting. Can you explain how you financed these losses?" David remained silent for several minutes, staring at the documents as if they were foreign objects he had never seen before. His public defender, a nervous young man named Carlos Ruiz, whispered constantly in his ear. "I am not obligated to answer those questions," David finally mumbled. "My personal financial activities have no relation to the drug trafficking charges." The prosecutor smiled faintly and placed the bank records showing the fraudulent transfers from my accounts on the table. "And these transfers? Are these also your personal financial activities?" David's reaction was immediate and revealing. His face turned pale, his hands started to shake, and he looked at his lawyer with an expression of absolute panic. It was clear he hadn't expected the authorities to have discovered the theft of money. Those transfers," he stammered. "My mother had verbally authorized me to handle certain minor business operations. Business operations worth $180,000 made to ghost accounts in tax havens?" the prosecutor pressed. "Did your mother specifically authorize you to steal her money to finance your gambling addictions?" David's lawyer tried to intervene, but the prosecutor continued relentlessly, now showing the transcripts of the intercepted phone conversations. "David, we have recordings of conversations where you specifically planned to frame your mother with drugs to gain control of her estate. Are you going to deny this evidence as well?" When the prosecutor played the recording where David said, "Once Mom is in a Colombian prison, we'll have years to liquidate her assets," my son's composure completely fell apart. He began to cry uncontrollably, not from remorse, but from self-pity for being caught. "You don't understand," he sobbed. "I was desperate. They were going to kill me if I didn't pay them. The Colombians don't joke around with these things." "So you admit that you contacted Colombian criminals to plant drugs in your mother's luggage?" the prosecutor insisted. "Yes," David shouted, completely losing control. "But I had no other choice. They were going to torture me to death. Patricia and I just wanted to survive." His lawyer desperately tried to stop the confession, but David had opened the floodgates and couldn't stop. For the next 20 minutes, he described every aspect of the plan in detail. How they had contacted the criminals, how much they had paid them, how they had practiced placing the drugs in my suitcase. The fake explosive device was Patricia's idea, he confessed through tears. She said that if Mom also faced terrorism charges, she would never be able to get out of a Colombian prison. The prosecutor seized the moment of vulnerability to get more information. "How long had you been planning this operation?" 8 months, David answered without hesitation. "Since February, when the debts became unpayable. Patricia researched all the laws. Michael helped us with the documents. Richard was supposed to coordinate everything from Colombia. Did your mother suspect anything?" "Nothing," David replied with a bitter smile. "She trusted us completely. She never reviewed her bank statements in detail. She never questioned our frequent visits to her house. It was very easy to deceive her." The ease with which David described manipulating me made me physically nauseous. Hearing him talk about me as if I were an easy, stupid victim was more painful than any financial aspect of his betrayal. Patricia's interrogation, scheduled for the afternoon of the same day, was equally revealing, but in a different way. While David had collapsed emotionally and confessed everything under pressure, Patricia maintained a calculated demeanor even in her desperate situation. She entered the interrogation room with her head held high, dressed in the prison uniform but maintaining a posture that tried to convey dignity. As a lawyer, she knew her rights and the strategies to minimize legal damage perfectly well. "Prosecutor Castillo," Patricia began before he could ask the first question, "I want it on the record that my client is willing to cooperate fully with the authorities to clear up this misunderstanding." The prosecutor looked at her with interest. "Misunderstanding? Are you referring to planning to frame your mother with drugs as a misunderstanding?" "I am referring," Patricia replied with professional coolness, "to the fact that the circumstances leading to these events are much more complex than they appear on the surface." Patricia tried to build a defense based on emotional manipulation and mitigating circumstances. She described David as a desperate addict who had dragged her into a situation that got out of her control, minimizing her own role as the legal architect of the entire conspiracy. "My brother was receiving death threats," she explained in a controlled voice. "As a lawyer and as a sister, I felt it was my responsibility to find a legal solution that would protect his life without actually harming my mother. A legal solution that included framing her with drugs and explosive devices, the prosecutor pressed. The original plan never included Mom actually being convicted, Patricia lied shamelessly. The idea was to create a temporary situation that would allow us to access resources to pay off David's debts and then prove Mom's innocence and restore everything to its original state. The prosecutor then showed Patricia's handwritten notebook with her detailed notes on the liquidation schedule. Seeing her own words in her own handwriting, Patricia's mask of professionalism began to crumble. "Patricia," the prosecutor said, reading directly from her notes. "In 1 week, all our problems will be over, and we will have full access to the $2.8 million. Does this sound like a temporary plan to help your brother?" For the first time in the interrogation, Patricia remained silent for several minutes. Her lawyer, an older woman with experience in complex criminal cases, whispered urgently in her ear. "I have no further comments without my personal attorney present," Patricia finally said, invoking her right to remain silent. But the prosecutor had one more card to play. "Patricia, your brother already confessed completely during his interrogation this morning. He described your role as the mastermind of the entire operation. Do you want to respond to his specific accusations?" The strategy worked. Furious at David's betrayal, Patricia abandoned her legal caution and began to defend herself by attacking her brother, revealing in the process additional details that only confirmed her guilt instead of reducing it. By the end of both interrogations, I had a complete and devastating picture of how my own children had meticulously planned my total destruction. The trial began on the 15th of January 2024 at the Cook County Circuit Court in Chicago. During the 4 months between the interrogations and the start of the trial, I had time to emotionally process the magnitude of my children's betrayal, but nothing prepared me for the experience of seeing them sitting in the defendant's dock. The courtroom was filled with journalists, onlookers, and some acquaintances from the business world who had followed the case through the media. The story of the businesswoman whose children tried to frame her with drugs to steal her inheritance had captured national attention. David and Patricia entered in handcuffs, wearing suits that I myself had bought them years ago for special occasions. The irony was painful. My money had paid for the clothes they were wearing while they faced charges for trying to destroy my life. The presiding judge, the Honorable Carlos Mendizabal, a 60-year-old man with a reputation for severity in family crime cases, read the formal charges against my children. The list was extensive and devastating. David Vance is accused of criminal conspiracy, international drug trafficking, document forgery, systematic bank fraud, and attempted unlawful imprisonment, the judge enumerated in a firm voice. Patricia Vance is accused of criminal conspiracy, complicity in drug trafficking, forgery of official documents, bank fraud, illegal practice of law, and attempted unlawful imprisonment. Michael Sierra was also present as a co-defendant, facing charges of notarial corruption, forgery of public documents, and complicity in bank fraud. The prosecution, represented by Fernando Castillo, built a meticulous case that lasted for 5 days. Every piece of evidence Anthony and I had collected was presented systematically: the bank records, the phone recordings, the forged documents, the interrogation confessions. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecutor played the recordings of the conversations between David and Patricia, planning my framing. Hearing their voices in the courtroom, coldly describing how they were going to destroy my life, produced an absolute silence among the attendees. "Once Mom is in a Colombian prison, we'll have years to liquidate her assets." David's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. Some journalists furiously took notes, while others simply watched with expressions of disbelief. Richard Miller was called as a key witness for the prosecution. His testimony was devastating to any hope of a defense my children might have had. He described in detail every meeting, every proposal they had made to him, every detail of the plan they had revealed. "They offered me $150,000 to help frame their own mother," Richard declared to the court. "When I asked them if they understood they were planning to destroy an innocent woman's life, David's exact words were, 'The old woman has lived long enough. Now it's our turn.'" Richard's testimony also included the presentation of the documents he had kept from the meetings with David and Patricia: schematics of bank transfers, lists of criminal contacts in Colombia, and drafts of the contracts they had prepared for the operation. When it was my turn to testify, I experienced a mix of pain and determination I had never felt before. Walking to the witness stand, knowing my own children were watching every word I said, was one of the hardest moments of my life. The prosecutor guided me through my testimony so that the timeline of events would be clear to the court. I described the signs I had ignored, the lies I had believed, the blind trust I had placed in David and Patricia for decades. Mrs. Vance, the prosecutor asked me, did you at any point suspect that your children could be planning something like this? Never, I answered with absolute honesty. David and Patricia knew every last detail of my financial life because I trusted them completely. They had keys to my house, they knew my passwords, they knew where I kept my important documents. That trust almost cost me the rest of my life. During the cross-examination, David's defense tried to paint me as a negligent mother who had ignored her children's financial needs, forcing them into desperate measures. Mrs. Vance, David's lawyer asked me, isn't it true that you categorically refused to help your son when he confessed his gambling problem to you? David never confessed a gambling problem to me, I replied firmly. He asked me for $50,000 for a cryptocurrency investment, which turned out to be a lie. If he had been honest about his real problems, we would have sought professional treatment instead of financing more bets. Patricia's defense adopted a different strategy, trying to present her as a loyal sister who was manipulated by David into participating in a plan that had supposedly gotten out of her control. Her lawyer argued that Patricia, as a legal professional, had tried to find legal solutions to David's problems, but that the situation had escalated beyond her original intentions. This defense completely fell apart when the prosecutor presented Patricia's handwritten notebook with her detailed notes on the liquidation schedule of my estate. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, reading directly from Patricia's notes, October 10th, everything is ready. In 1 week we will have full access to the $2.8 million. Does this sound like someone who was manipulated, or like the mastermind of a criminal operation? The testimony of the forensic experts was equally devastating. The analysis of David's computer showed he had installed specialized software to monitor my banking activities for months, systematically capturing my passwords and access patterns. The document experts confirmed that the signatures on the power of attorney documents were expert forgeries, but with enough detectable differences to prove fraudulent intent. The bank investigators explained to the court how David had used sophisticated techniques to hide the fraudulent transfers, designing each operation to evade automatic fraud detection systems. Mr. David Vance demonstrated professional knowledge of bank evasion, one declared. The transfers followed patterns that only someone with specialized training in money laundering could have designed. The fifth day of the trial was dedicated to the testimony of the Colombian experts who had investigated the criminal network David had contacted to plant the drugs in my luggage. Via video conference from Bogotá, an officer from the Colombian National Police described how they had identified and arrested the criminals who had collaborated with my children. The suspects confirmed they received payments of $75,000 to plant 1.5 kilograms of cocaine and a fake explosive device in the luggage of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the Colombian officer stated. They also confirmed that the specific instructions included ensuring the charges were serious enough to guarantee a sentence of at least 20 years in prison. When the presentations ended, the court retired to deliberate. The 3 hours of waiting were the longest of my life. I knew the evidence was overwhelming, but seeing my own children facing possible decades in prison produced conflicting feelings of justice and loss. When the court returned, Judge Mendizabal read the verdict with judicial solemnity. In the case of the state versus David Vance, Patricia Vance, and Michael Sierra, this court finds all 3 defendants guilty of all charges presented. The sentences were severe but fair. David received 9 years in prison for leading the conspiracy. Patricia received 7 years for her role as the legal architect of the plan, and Michael received 5 years for notarial corruption and complicity. In addition to the prison terms, the court ordered the complete seizure of all assets acquired with stolen money, including the property in Colombia, and the full restitution of the $180,000 stolen from my accounts. The judge concluded his sentencing with words that will stay with me forever. This court has rarely seen a case of family betrayal as calculated and cruel as this one. The defendants not only planned to steal their mother's estate, but to completely destroy her life, her freedom, and her dignity. The severity of these sentences reflects the extreme gravity of their crimes. 6 months after the trial, in July 2024, I made a decision that would definitively change the course of my life. I moved to Portland, Maine. Far from Chicago, far from the memories, far from everything that connected me to the previous life my children had tried to destroy. The house I chose was modest compared to my old home in the Gold Coast, a 2-bedroom apartment near the sea, with a terrace from which I could see the Atlantic Ocean stretched to the horizon. In the mornings, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs replaced the noise of Chicago traffic I had been accustomed to for decades. The recovery of my assets had been almost complete. The authorities had seized the Cartagena property that David and Patricia had bought with stolen money, frozen all their bank accounts, and recovered 89% of the $180,000 they had systematically stolen from me during those 8 months of betrayal. More important than the financial recovery was the restraining order the court had issued. David and Patricia were prohibited from coming within 500 yards of me for the next 10 years, even after serving their prison sentences. It was a legal protection I had specifically requested, not out of physical fear, but out of an emotional need to permanently close that chapter of my life. During my first few months in Portland, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years: genuine peace. I spent my mornings walking along Higgins Beach, watching the local fishermen prepare their nets and the tourists begin to arrive at the coastal cafes. I spent the afternoons reading on my terrace, rediscovering books I had abandoned during my years of obsessive business building, biographies of entrepreneurs, historical novels, essays on Eastern philosophy that helped me process the traumatic experience I had lived through. Richard Miller became a frequent visitor. Every 2 weeks, he would take the train from Chicago to spend the weekend in Portland, and our conversations became fundamental to my emotional healing process. His decision to alert me at the airport had not only saved my freedom, it had saved my entire life. "Eleanor," he said during one of his visits in September, "I know it's painful, but I think David and Patricia did you an unintentional favor." "A favor?" I asked, surprised by his perspective. "They set you free," Richard replied. "For years you lived carrying the responsibility of caring for 2 adults who only saw you as a bank account. Now you are free to live for yourself." His words held more truth than I initially wanted to admit. For decades, every financial decision, every investment plan, every business strategy had been conditioned by my desire to leave a substantial inheritance for David and Patricia. Now, for the first time in 40 years, I could make decisions based solely on my own interests and desires. I decided to use part of my recovered assets to fund a charitable foundation focused on helping victims of family fraud and elderly people who had been exploited by their own relatives. The Michael Vance Foundation, named in honor of my late husband, began operations in October 2024, based in Portland. Working with the foundation gave me a renewed purpose that I hadn't expected to find at 66. Every case we handled reminded me that my experience, however painful, had made me uniquely qualified to help others facing similar betrayals. During the first year of operation, the foundation handled 43 cases of family financial abuse, elderly people whose children had forged documents to seize their pensions, parents who had discovered their adult children had used their identities to apply for fraudulent loans, grandparents who had been emotionally manipulated into transferring properties to grandchildren who then abandoned them in nursing homes. Each story was different in its details, but they all shared the same devastating core: the betrayal of those we love most and trust the most. My personal experience allowed me to connect with these victims in a way that no outside professional could. One November afternoon, while reviewing foundation documents in my study, I received an unexpected letter. The sender was David, writing from the Supermax prison where he was serving his sentence. The letter was long, full of rehearsed-sounding apologies and pleas for forgiveness that seemed more motivated by the regret of being caught than by genuine moral remorse. David described the prison conditions. He expressed his desire to rebuild our family relationship and suggested that we could overcome this misunderstanding if I were willing to visit him. I read the entire letter twice, feeling a mixture of sadness and resolution. Then, without replying, I placed it in my fireplace and watched it turn to ash. Some betrayals are so deep that forgiveness, while possible, does not require reconciliation or the restoration of relationships that have proven to be toxic. Patricia also tried to contact me, but through her lawyer. The legal communication suggested the possibility of family mediation, which could benefit both parties if I were willing to reconsider certain legal aspects of the case. I correctly interpreted that she was seeking a reduction in her sentence in exchange for some kind of public forgiveness from me. My response, sent through my own lawyer, was clear and final. I had no interest in any kind of mediation, reconciliation, or future communication with either of my children. The choices they had made had permanent consequences, and I had chosen to continue my life without them. In December 2024, exactly 1 year after the verdict, I received official notification that the asset forfeiture process was completely finished. The Cartagena property had been sold by the Colombian authorities, and the money obtained, minus legal and administrative costs, had been transferred to my account in the United States. With this definitive legal closure, I decided to do something Michael and I had planned for years but never got around to. I bought a 40-foot sailboat and started taking sailing lessons at the Portland Yacht Club. Learning to sail at 66 turned out to be a perfect metaphor for my new life. Each trip out to sea required careful planning, respect for natural forces I couldn't control, and trust in my own ability to make real-time decisions based on changing information. The afternoon sailing in the bay became my moments of greatest inner peace. Away from the coast, surrounded only by water and sky, I could reflect on the path I had traveled without the noise of the immediate emotions that had previously dominated me. One afternoon in January 2025, while returning to the harbor after a particularly satisfying sail, I realized I had spent several hours without once thinking about David, Patricia, or anything that had happened. For the first time in over a year, my mind had been completely present in the current moment, focused on the wind, the sails, and the simple joy of being alive and free. That night, sitting on my terrace with a glass of wine and watching the harbor lights, I reflected on the final irony of this whole experience. David and Patricia had planned to steal my fortune to finance their lives of excess and irresponsibility. Instead, they had given me something far more valuable: the freedom to live authentically without the burden of toxic family expectations, and the wisdom that only comes from surviving the deepest possible betrayal. At 66, I had discovered that life could begin again, even after those you love most try to completely destroy it. The most painful betrayal had, paradoxically, become my most profound liberation. If you liked this story, support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your opinions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box that appears on the left. Thanks for joining us.